everyone. It is day 6 of COP29, and today we focus on science and technology. And we're delighted to start the day with 2 experts who can help us understand, in particular, this new terminology around eco-assets and eco-markets. Got a lot of experience between them. I'm delighted to introduce, first of all, Jacob Clayton, who is the CEO of Sage Int, and also, incidentally, our sponsor for the pavilion. Thank you so much to Sage Int for that. And next to Jacob is Nate Wynn, and Nate is the Chief Executive Officer also of Floodlight. So you've been working up some very interesting partnerships and initiatives on this issue. Of course, we're addressing digital assets for transparency. We're going to have a deep dive into Floodlight's approach to eco-asset monitoring, because as we've been saying really since Paris, parliaments are responsible for MRV, for monitoring, reporting and verification, and we'd like them to understand this landscape, which is developing extremely quickly at pace, much better, so they can play a meaningful role in this. So gentlemen, over to you now to explain this issue. Thank you very much for your time. And to those of us who are joining live stream and in person, please do stick with us until the very end. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Malini. And it is an honor to be able to sponsor Globe Legislators this year. And at COP, now we're on day 6. It's been a learning adventure, is probably the best way to describe it. You know, as we've had a lot of parliamentary folks roll through this pavilion, we found that there's a lot of legislation being developed. Yesterday, I think, yeah, it was yesterday, Brazil, it passed in the Senate that their greenhouse gas legislation has been passed. And for Sagent, we just see this as a massive opportunity to take the legislation that's been developed and create your compliance system of record, or essentially a state machine that can convert the text of any policy into a process and then monitor that process at scale. So that's the heart of what we do. And we've been working in the DRC to develop the cap and trade program and to take this legislation and make it scalable. One of the key things that happens is we take the high quality data and we convert it into a digital asset. And that digital asset, you could do a lot of things with it. You could trade it, you can monitor its entire life cycle. And what enables you to do that is what sits behind the digital asset, and that's the data contract. That's where it takes a blockchain, a set of instructions, and enables you to track the life cycle of that entire digital asset. And that's really where Sagent stops, and we have to from a regulatory perspective, where we develop digital asset exchanges and compliance programs of record. But even as a self-regulating organization, we need to have MRV firms, or monitoring, reporting, verification firms, to come in and make sure that the data that we're reporting is actually accurate. And that's taking that real world asset, anything that's happening in the physical world, and converting that into digital information that's bankable, insurable, rateable. And that's really where the conversation with Nate, CEO of Floodlight, comes in. So Nate, Floodlight is an MRV firm, and you do focus on environmental monitoring, but do you mind giving us some background on why Floodlight is where it's at? Maybe touch a little bit on your strategic work with KPMG, and then some of the work you're doing here at COP.
Yeah, happy to. Hi everyone, I'm Nate Wine. Great to meet you all. And a lot of Floodlight's history, we're 5 years old. We were founded in the United States, recently expanded into Austria. That's our European headquarters. That's where I recently moved with my family. A lot of that expansion was driven by our work with KPMG and some other firms that, as you highlighted, are really focused now because of the regulatory environment as well as their businesses that they represent and work for, and really getting a lot more objectivity and a lot more verification, DMRV, digital measurement, reporting and verification, on everything they're doing. And in the past, especially on environmental lines, it's been easier to kind of make a narrative and make a fun story and say, here's a new website I launched, or here's a working group, and don't look at all this other stuff. But really where Floodlight comes in is we want to remove the trust-based system where everybody just says, here are my emissions, or here are my climate risks, or here is what I've committed to and promised. with actually a scientific validated approach that's undergirded by the best academic publications on the planet. My co-founder is a professor at Boston University, Dr. Suchi Gopal, who's really published in this for 20 years on how to do this to where investors, stakeholders, countries, everyone can really see a clear chain either through blockchain or through one custody of assets held in the same name as it moves forward. We really do think this is going to be the beginning of any requirement. If you want to trust a digital asset or a physical asset, you really need to see the chain of custody from the beginning and giving them objective info from a satellite, which is how Floodlight works. We use a system of 9 satellite networks, public and private, to really take a direct measurement of greenhouse gases or climate risks, et cetera, and then have that be our baseline rather than most of the industry, which just starts at disclosure.
That's very helpful, and I think if we could just step back a couple steps, and any technology that exists because it emerges out of a human need, and we find that with MRV, it actually didn't really start with what we would call eco assets. It started in the banking sector. If you're moving capital, if you're moving trusted assets, you need to make sure if you're doing it, especially on behalf of someone else, that you're doing it the right way. Can you give us some perspective on your history in banking and why the transition? Why do you think the MRV or that the digital monitoring is so important?
Sure. Yeah. So I was in capital markets for 15 years at a couple of American banks. And towards the end of my tenure there, I had a lot more customers who would call to do a foreign exchange trade with me or do an interest rate swap. And they would say, hey, cool, we'll do the trade. But by the way, I need to invest these funds for the next 60 days or 2 years in an ETF or a mutual fund or some other financial vehicle. Oh, and by the way, it can't be doing X activity, or it can't have exposure to this, or it can't be seen as representative of one political overview of another. So I went to my software systems that my bank provided for me, and they were paying more for the software that I had access to than my salary, which is super fun. But so you would expect the veracity of that data to become totally correct and beyond reproach. My wife is a librarian. She's got her master's in it. And so she was over my shoulder once while I was trying to get a strategy for how to invest funds. And she's like, click deeper. How are they getting this data that's saying XYZ about this company? And so I would click, kind of annoyed, like, oh, this is big banker stuff, whatever. She's like, no, click further. And I noticed after we did a couple of trades, almost the entire market was run on just company disclosure. You have to trust the companies themselves to say this is what we're doing and this is what we're not doing with zero verification behind it, and it's just copy-pasted into these online encyclopedias that are hysterically expensive and in the end built on trust. So that was kind of the impetus, was I felt frustrated that I had been directing tens or hundreds of millions of dollars into financial vehicles that promised one thing but had nothing but a promise at the bottom of it. And that's what led to the founding of Floodlight, is I felt like I was not the only person who would feel a little ripped off that way. Like, people really want their money, their stakeholders, and their really personal commitments to really matter in the work they do.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because I think it was two years ago, Barclays had a big analysis on where this environmental data is coming from, and they said there's a large portion, I don't remember the percentage off the top of my head, most of the environmental data was from self-reporting. And when you're moving the hundreds of millions of dollars, it is important to have some veracity to the source of data, or at least there's integrity in the humans on the ground. Just a quick aside, in the Marine Corps, I spent 15 years in the Marine Corps, and for 3 years, I did a special program where I went to 22 different embassies and consulates in the East Asia Pacific. So we had from Mongolia down to Australia. My job was to do compliance, and so I was the reporter. I was kind of the bad guy always going into the embassies, but I would go in, and I had to look my own eyes, make a report to see. There was a 702-point inspection. So we did that for 3 years, and what I found at the end of that, and we made a lot of recommendations, is how do you automate that? There's a lot of miles and there's a lot of people and resources being spent for compliance, but we have the tools, right? Like, ideally, the technology would be able to partially solve or help automate and accelerate that. I think also aspirationally, by 2030, especially listening to the IMF and the World Bank, they're talking about trillions, multiple trillions of dollars going into this eco asset market, and a lot of this is based on self-reporting, organizations right now. So when you look at where we're at now, and how to provide a scalable, trustable system, what do you think are the key elements? And then maybe we can go into the key elements.
Sure.
A bit.
Yeah, so first key element for any MRV firm is they need to have international bona fides that really highlight and align with key commitments like the ones being made at COP. And for my work, that's usually ISO standards. So 14064 is a big one for any firm claiming to do what we do. If they don't have an ISO certification, it's just trust us.
Can you break that down? Because I think as we talk, the standards booth, by the way, for anyone at COP, is right around the corner. Fascinating conversation because there's so many categories, of standards, and you're talking about the ISO standard.
Yep.
What essentially does that require you to do?
Sure. So ISO, International Standards Organization, it's a Swiss outfit that's really kind of the Harvard of regulatory bodies for firms like mine, so anybody that does MRV. A lot of what ISO does in an audit, if you want to get the designation of being aligned with 14064, you have to hire a firm that knows ISO protocol and then can actually look over everything you do and everything that you present and say this is in accordance, almost like an attorney would look at your living trust. What they did with us for 14064 is over a period of multiple months, they looked at our formation documents, every paper that had been published by us, which is a stack this high from my co-founders, to really say, one, is the data more accurate than just doing the trust me method? And then second, the key method that a lot of companies do, especially mining companies, is they'll do attribution. So they'll say, if I mined X tons of cobalt, that equates to about this many tons of carbon, which is not scientific, but it is allowable under the ISO standard. So what our ISO certification, and it's through a CERTA, so ISO itself does not do the audit, it's organizations that align with them. But they look at everything we do to make sure, one, that it aligns, and two, that it's as good or better than what the attribution model would be. And that's where I think almost everybody on a logical basis wants to understand, like, am I actually being sold something, or is there a fact behind this? And with us, our source data is a satellite reading. So it's very hard to argue when it's, hey, this is what the company said versus this is what we can actually observe on the ground with a spectral image.
Interesting. And so are there any other categorically other standards that you have to abide by for your processes?
There are a lot. It depends on the country. So most countries will fall under ISO, especially the wealthier countries. But each country has the purview of developing its own process. Specifically, if they're mining or if a lot of what they actually produce goes overseas, they can introduce their own process on top to provide this MRV. And I think that's a great way for countries themselves to really show, this is my commitment to my own people, and this is the commitment to the wealth that these minerals, et cetera, or products will benefit to them, in saying, I have a clear trail through blockchain, even viewable by everybody, that adds the value and makes it transferable a lot easier than just trust me.
So going back to the data contract, it's important for a digital asset exchange operator and developer to make sure in the data contract it says it must be X ISO standard for the entity that's providing the data, so that as you're trading that digital asset, there's a lot of traceability, so that it's quality data and it's done by the right people. So we've been talking a lot about the standards. It seems that the other element of trust or integrity is having the right academic pedigree of the people on the team. So are you a scientist?
I'm not.
I am not. Okay.
My two co-founders are.
Can you give a background on them and why they're working at Floodlight? What is their reason and their mission there?
Yeah, happy to. So Dr. Suchi Gopal is my co-founder, along with Josh Pitts, who's our Chief Technology Officer. Suchi's our Chief Science Officer. A lot of her motivation in her academic work at Boston University and others has really been to help the Earth. That's kind of her mantra as a person. And then essentially the exercise of that has been through scientific approaches to what is actually helping on it. So she's had commissions from the World Bank, from the U.S. Federal Wind Commission. She and Josh, my other co-founder, are publishing a book that's coming out in 2 weeks called The FinTech Revolution, which essentially highlights a lot of what geospatial technology can do, not just for companies, but for countries and for other bodies that actually do have a voice and really should use it more often with kind of the power that entails. So a lot of her work really has been in saying, if all we do is trust companies and then also bash companies to say, why aren't you doing more? We've essentially said, don't try. And so on the flip side, where I come in as an ex-banker, is if you provide a good enough carrot, the businesses will operate under the rules that the government wants anyway, because most political leaders are saying, hey, protect where I live, make the schools better, make the roads better, et cetera. If you provide a carrot that actually works for everybody to make money and produce the standards that the country has already agreed to, it's a pretty winning combination. So at Floodlight, we're strictly politically neutral, and we don't want to vilify anybody. We just say, let the data decide, and that's all Suchi's work. And she has hundreds of publications on this to say the data can really make a lot of the political problems and a lot of the kind of challenges from the current events issues go away, in saying, here is the actual data on this, make your own decision.
Interesting. And what university is she affiliated with, and maybe some of the work she's done for the university?
Boston University. She's a tenured professor there in the geospatial geography department. Josh Pitts, our CTO, he's a published author in his own right. He got his master's at UT Austin, but he was actually one of her star students. That's how the two of them essentially got together. Floodlight had gone through an accelerator program, and they noticed, some of our investors noticed, like, Nate, you're good at banking and finance and sales. Nobody will trust you if you don't have the academic acumen. And so we had a common friend that put the two of us together and said, Josh, Suchi, and Nate, you three together can kind of put the business spin on this in a way that makes money and protects the academic integrity of what's going to happen. And that's what attracted firms like KPMG and others, is because they said, look, we don't want to be geospatial scientists. We want to do audit. We want to do consulting. We want to rely on the best partners to do this accurately. And then the rest has been kind of a nice roller coaster race. But
that's interesting. So we're building this arc where, we have solid standards and certification bodies validating the entity and the people and the process and the technology. You have the right academic credentials, and the folks who are tenured professors. What about the stakeholders? You have quite a few customers already. You've worked in various countries globally. Can you give us a little preview about your strategic relationship with KPMG, and what's their role, and how would you two work together?
Sure. Yeah, so KPMG, we got connected with them through Mass Challenge, as an accelerator program in Boston, where a lot of our team is. And they were really looking for what they saw in the market as a lot of people frustrated on the integrity side. So just trying to understand what's the chain of ownership of a specific asset, so that they could put KPMG's stamp on a Scope 1 emissions document or a climate risk analytics recommendation or materiality statement. But they were concerned because they didn't have the education. And a lot of our customers, our initial customers too, the people that are getting put into these sustainability roles and the sustainability reporting roles, they used to be in the finance team. And so they're used to P&L and defending EPS and all the other fun acronyms that I could dazzle you with as an ex-banker, but it's not a transferable skill. And it's much, much more challenging if you have an education in finance to then move that over to sustainability. So a lot of our focus has been in making sure all of our material, all of our content, and all of our communication to KPMG and others is logical to anybody from any background, and hence the focus on data. We have had times where clients have asked us, show me the literal satellite reading of where this is because it disagrees with my attribution number. And we go down to the 1 and the 0 to show them, look, here is the data, here's our process, here is the result. This is why you can better inform that with the data being the foundation instead of the trust. So that's a lot of where they've gone. And we've expanded worldwide with them since, because that's a pretty universal aim, I think, of businesses.
Wow, so KPMG relies on you, your company, your process, the tech platform, to inform their clients on yes or no they are meeting certain requirements. Is that correct? correct?
I would say that they hold the consulting side first to say you are in compliance, 100% theirs. I am strictly a data provider to them so that they can have more information. So as an example, with some of our clients in Europe, CSRD is a major regulation that a lot of them are facing, and they have to publish their scope 1 and scope 2 numbers, so how much emissions they do from direct and purchased energy. And so what a lot of the KPMG teams in Europe will do is they'll take our data, which I can go over one asset, so an oil platform or a farm or an office building 100 times in a year, versus their equivalent, which is usually a one-time inspection with a clipboard and making a lot of observations. An auditor is going to feel a lot more confident seeing 100 different readings at different seasons, different times of day, and different production times, saying this is pretty consistent, instead of everything that happened on April 12th is indicative of the other 364 days. So that's where we kind of play a role with them the strongest.
Okay. So we have the standards, and hopefully I can remember this as we get to point 4 or 12 or beyond.
Plenty of time, Jacob, plenty of time.
So we have the standards bodies, you have the academic credentials, you have the stakeholders, the customers. There seems to be, as you've been discussing so far, some eco-focused projects, but also mining and oil. What exactly are you observing
Sure.
for them?
So specifically on mining, I think this is one of our most interesting use cases. We've got some pension funds that use us to essentially do due diligence or MRV, so just checking to see if these disclosures are actually correct for the investments where they have a material hold. So we had one pension fund who had a significant exposure in mining interests in Africa, and they identified a couple of key mines who had made very, very significant public commitments on reforesting or recreating biodiversity that had been lost in open pit, and they were recreating this after. And I went to high school and college in Salt Lake City, Utah, and so across the valley you can see Kennecott Copper Mine was one of the biggest open pit mines in the world, and they didn't really come under pressure to reforest until I was in college, so in the early aughts. And I saw it happen, where you could actually see this mountain that really looked like a nuke had hit it, and I'm not kidding, it really looked terrible. And then over 10 years, reallocating a specific percentage of their profits that they had publicly committed to because of shareholder advocacy to reforesting, so putting on plants, moving dirt as topsoil back on top of the mine itself, and made it, and it's not gorgeous yet, but it's certainly a lot better than it was when I went there. But that's essentially what we really were used for in Africa, was to say these firms have made massive commitments that really impact the people around them and just the planet in general. Are they doing it, or is this just a pretty PDF? And so for us, it was fun to actually go through. Our data goes back to 2012, so we can really see trend analysis. We can see if there's new leadership, like pretty quickly right after they took over, if there was a change, either positive or negative for it, and then track that pretty well to say this company is doing what they're saying they're doing, or here's what we observed, you make the decision.
Okay, so that's really an ecology monitoring over X period of time. Is there certain things you would do for an oil rig? What would you be observing for an oil rig specifically?
Sure. So almost every oil company now is coming under a lot of pressure for methane. Because it's obviously much more potent than carbon. It's where a lot more of it happens in the energy process. So most of them are trying to do an added verification that their methane number is correct, because the fines, potential fines for if they're off, can be 4% of EBITDA, which is hysterically enormous. So a lot of them are focused on saying, look, here's how I've reported. I've said I make this many gallons or this many liters of petrol or any of the other kind of distillates that I can do. Here are my reports for the last 4 years. Are they correct? Because everything has been on that attribution model. And what we find is the term fugitive emissions, so an emission where you don't expect it to be happening. In the commercial world, that's mostly refrigerants leaking, but the rest of the world, that's anything where you don't know what's leaking because it's an accident, it's fugitive. And we've found that a lot with our mining and oil companies, is there's a lot of emissions happening on their significant assets that they don't know about, because you really need tracking from the sky to do what we call hot spotting. So to say, like, if you had 84 tons of carbon that came out in this last year from this site, where on this huge site, because some of these are hundreds of hectares, we can actually show you on a map exactly where most of them are coming from, and it's really revealing data, because sometimes management has no idea where their process is creating the emissions, or they think it's all at a smokestack when really it's at an extraction point or it's at delivery. So it's really useful info for a business from an operational standpoint as well as for a regulatory, because if you're off on emissions, the regulators don't care if you tried your best or had a great sensor put on in the wrong place. That's a fine.
Interesting. So it seems to be the thematic here is you're monitoring molecules from space. And if you're monitoring molecules, it's the carbon or the buildup of a forest or an ecological system. You're monitoring for methane output. Any ocean-based or mining. Are you doing any monitoring of, let's say, the volume of extraction from the mine? Is that a monitorable thing you could do?
It's harder. So anything that's not fixed, we can't measure a full production coming out of a mine as well, because they usually cover the minerals when they come out as well from the ground. We can really monitor the pace of activity, and then we usually will compare that against their published numbers. So if you have a mine where you get 8 tons of copper or cobalt or whatever per year, we can track that down to an average and then put it down to the shifts. It's a lot of AI and just direct data analysis, but that's discoverable info. That's really easy for us to pull. Where it really helps is really to identify exactly if the policies and procedures that they're kind of praising themselves about are actually working. So we really can monitor a lot. Scope 3 is everything in the supply chain, which we can't touch because satellites are not, I'm not rich enough to task a satellite with tracking every truck someday. But the process for it now is to really say, like, here is step 1, step 2, and then once it moves off, we know precisely what it's done.
Interesting. Then doing a double click on the molecules, you're using satellites that are tens, hundreds of kilometers away. You're monitoring at a very granular level, and you're telling me that you're monitoring the molecules. So as we're talking about certification, academic validation, and it seems your KPMG and industry trust this, but why do they trust it? Why do they trust the technology? So can you just give us an overview? How does the monitoring work from an architecture perspective?
Sure.
And then we can go down a little deeper.
Yeah, of course. So I'm the only non-scientist of the 3 founders, so I always make them explain it to me as a child.
You are the perfect person to ask this question to.
And so I always have Suchi and Josh explain it to me on a limited education basis as possible until I get it. But essentially all of our marketing does, it's called a spectral image. So when a satellite lines up with the sun, that lines up with an asset on the Earth, you can actually see on a spectral image the exact molecular signature of carbon or methane or nitrous or any of the polycarbonate gases. You can do that pass as long as there's no cloud. If there's a cloud, we have to wait for the next pass, et cetera. But we can usually cover any part of the Earth every 4 days from our satellite network. And essentially, we can take a picture then, on a spectral image, you can actually see how many of those molecules there are. So if we do 100 passes of that in a year, we can then extrapolate that to the full 365 a lot more accurately than somebody just doing a one-time inspection with a device, holding in the air and hoping it worked. We're also one of the only companies we know of, we wish others would do this, but one of the only ones we know of that actually have a wind algorithm that actually factors in all the traditional winds that are coming in. We found in Los Angeles, where I'm from, we actually did this for a jeans company. They were a very high-end, expensive jeans company that was right next to another one that was very low-end, and they said their emissions were X. We came in and did our analysis and found that they were Y. They were very unhappy about it. When we applied it and showed them the wind model, they had actually been counting the emissions coming from the cheaper one in theirs because they just had a sensor up, and that was blowing traditionally east. So they were reporting a lot higher emissions than they had to because they had a sensor that said that's what it is. If you're not controlling for wind, you're probably controlling for, or not controlling, you're probably reporting on a lot of carbon that's not yours.
That is the first time I've heard about a wind algorithm, but it makes sense because it's affecting the molecules, and you're trying to get a state of where the molecules are located. So you have your multi, or do you use hyperspectral as well?
We don't use hyperspectral. We just use standard spectral. We don't really need to on hyperspectral yet. Like, it certainly can go further, and usually a 10 or 30 meter resolution is enough for us to do the measurement. We certainly can go deeper if we need to, but the costs increase there significantly.
Definitely. And looking out into the future just a little bit, if you were able to go from a multi to hyperspectral, Does that give you new capabilities? And essentially what we're talking about right now is as you monitor, you're putting a floodlight or a light against a molecule, you're capturing what is reflected back, right? And you're figuring out what the wavelength is, and you're recording that. That enables you to figure out what the signature of the molecule is. So there's a high veracity. It's well studied in science. It's well known. Hyperspectral seems to be able to give you a lot more granularity, but a lot more data to handle as well.
Yeah, the comparison I'd make, and again, I'm from Los Angeles, so I always go back to movies, but if you've seen The Hunger Games, the heroine is actually stuck in a tree in part of it, and there's a camera that literally comes out of the angle and takes a picture of her because she's trying to get sponsors, etc. Hyperspectral is kind of to that detail, to where you can really go all the way down to like what freckles on somebody's face are, and like that approach. You don't really need that for what we're doing. It certainly is awesome. I'm not saying it's not cool, but in terms for what we'll need and what, at least for the next 20 years, it's a little beyond scope of what the industry needs to make the changes that it's committed to. A lot of the benefit we have seen is if customers are highlighting, like in the example we talked about of reforesting, if they're highlighting a lot of trees that have been planted, usually what happens is you'll plant a ton of trees and then the undergrowth, so like the weeds and the little bushes and everything else will grow and sometimes choke the trees. We can now see that pretty well with spectral image, but hyperspectral would let us see which one of the trees that are planted are dead because they got choked out by the undergrowth that goes faster. So we can distinguish between the canopy and the undergrowth, and the canopy obviously sequesters a ton more carbon than the undergrowth. So you kind of want to match that.
No pun intended. What strikes me about the different technologies is it's very much like Tesla making a huge bet about a decade ago on only passive cameras, where a lot of other car companies made huge bets on active LiDAR or that light radar. And the problem is Tesla solved it, and it worked great. It was a technology that was good enough for what you needed it to be. And right now, passive imaging is industry standard. And what happened on the back end is the AI just got better, generally. AI just got better. Instead of spending a lot more on high-end sophisticated sensors, they moved up the tech stack, and they essentially solved an easier problem at scale. And that really gets to what's behind your sensors. You mentioned a win algorithm, which is the first time I've heard about that. There's a lot of open source algorithms and programs out there that can take this sensory data, which is satellites and ground sensors, I assume, as well?
Some ground sensors. It's vast majority is satellite data, but we do have some ground.
And so you process that. I'm assuming KPMG or your certifications, do they look at those algorithms to make sure that there's no funny business in the data?
Absolutely. Yeah. Then the vetting process there is pretty intense because it's obviously their name. KPMG is well known much more than Floodlight is. So a lot of what they're trying to approach in this is we're comfortable putting our stamp on it only when we've seen the actual output work pretty well. And the approach we've taken is we're now into the tens of thousands of assets that we've reviewed globally. So we have a pretty nice repository of data to make a large language model of, okay, if you're an extraction company doing this type of metal in DRC or Mexico or Canada, we know about where you should be. And then if the AI that does a lot of our initial analysis throws that as an outlier, either as a overperformer or underachiever, that goes directly to one of our human analysts to say why. And then we look for the mitigating factors, like is there a broken pipe? Is there another site on it? Like we did one where the client didn't know that they actually had their own power generation facility on site. They thought they were buying it from the grid, and that changed their scope 2 drastically because we showed them a picture. And they're like, oh, we never thought of including this. We thought this was on a different parcel. And we're like, we should. And that's, I mean, if I could just steal the mic for a little bit longer, we were in New York in Climate Week a few weeks ago, and a lot of the focus there from the Big Four was restatements. Watching for companies that have already reported scope 1 or climate risk or tacked on something to how much they've actually extracted. But now they're going back with more of an approach like ours, more evidence-based approach, and saying, oops, we said it was 17, it's actually 84. A good thing to watch for now is those firms that are doing it are probably being proactive because the science is pretty new. You have to really want to move away from the attribution model, which has been around since 2002, to now this evidence-based approach. If people are still restating these numbers materially next year or the year after, I think you have issues that you want to look at. And as a stakeholder, as an investor, board member, et cetera, you want to check again for ISO alignment, and you want to check again for why did they restate? Was this restatement driven because they have a new methodology, or they just hired a different auditor, et cetera? Understanding that gives you a pretty good flavor of how much importance either the country, the firm, the city, et cetera, puts on this. So it's a nice little bellwether of, I think, what's coming.
Wow. So the restatement, it seems that there's a different approach, or there's an evolution where some modeling was going on, and now more measurement
That's
is
exactly
going
right.
on.
Yep.
Can you flesh that out a little bit? Because I think you said during the restatement there was, how did you phrase it? Some of the modeling activities.
Yeah, so before a restatement, usually they would use an Excel spreadsheet. That's what everybody does. And they would say, our product that we make, so let's call it gold, if we pull out X tons of gold from the ground, per ton is going to be 10,000 tons of carbon to get it from the ground to where we sell it on the market. And that's was validated in 2004 by usually a independent energy consultant that would give them that number, like this much gold equals this much carbon. The restatement now is where they're actually starting to say, like, hey, I don't really know if the math from cell T6 to cell C5 actually works. And I didn't know about fugitive emissions. We also changed 4 parts of the site, et cetera. Here's the new sales methods we've done, sometimes to the positive, because a lot of firms have used a lot of money that they're getting from this to really reinvest so they can say, look, I'm being conscientious. I'm being a good steward of your shareholding or your advocacy, and I want to prove that I'm doing it. But if you use this Excel-based model of like I made this much widget and it equates to this much carbon or methane or whatever, you're doing a massive disservice. And the tech isn't even that expensive. You know, like we're not hysterically cheap, but we're a lot better than having somebody fly out there every month and take a measurement and then report it back. And you can sleep a lot better at night knowing 4% of your EBITDA is not going away from Brussels or Tokyo or DC or somewhere else. Well, probably not DC.
So the difference between modeling and measurement, the modeling, they use kind of this parametric model of sorts. The measurement, obviously you're doing passes regularly, you're pulling down satellite. In terms of the measurement though, how is that measurably better than the modeling? Or
Sure.
Maybe a better way to ask the question is your certainty. Because now you're still going to be off. No measurement is going to be perfect.
Yep.
You're still going to be off, but what is there a percentage, or how would we think about the accuracy level that changes, or accuracy and consistency?
Yeah, great question. So Acerta, who did our ISO audit, that was a key part of what they were looking for, was can you give us an example that we can audit where they had reported this number through their model, which was the model-based approach, and then yours, which was the measurement-based approach. We gave them about 12 examples. The average we saw from the firms that had obviously spent money and taken this very seriously was around 5%. So it's very, very close to what is getting reported as well. And remember that a lot of these protocols over the last 15 years, people were given massive latitude to legally guess and say, hey, do your best, here is the approach, we're just starting to get the process going, so kind of do some experimentation and figure it out, which was nice, and that's the only way to transition. You can't affect huge change by saying, everybody tomorrow do this. But now, that's so antiquated with what the technology can do. So 5% I would say was the average for what we're actually able to see, and that's on greenhouse gas as well as on climate risk. But on reforestation, on biodiversity threats, on saltwater intrusion, creep, et cetera, that's all super observable with the technology we have, but you need to really do it scientifically. If firms have only been doing the model-based approach, it's going to be a rough awakening.
And right now, the industry's, or your standard, let's say, is the measurement-based standard. Where do you see it going from measurements? You know, because the certainty of a satellite passing over that you're particulate per square inch, or what's the right way to...
Parts per million even.
Parts per million of methane. Is there, what's your accuracy level on that? Or sorry, your certainty level on that?
Sure. So with us, every piece of data that Floodlight provides, we provide a confidence ratio of 1 to 5, 1 being not at all confident and 5 being as confident as possible. And with those, we'll give a memo line on anything where it's below a 4 to explain why. So for instance, there are a lot of places in South America and then the Great Plains of Asia where the winds are completely unpredictable. Like they go massive different directions and they're incredibly strong. So it's really hard for us to really map what is probably happening, and that would bring our confidence ratio down. If we identify anything on site, like the energy producing one I mentioned earlier, that obviously brings our confidence ratio down for what they told us. Because one of the key things that we need in the beginning of the process is called a shape file. So if any of you have been on the US real estate site called Zillow, you can actually see the value of homes, et cetera. That little panel that opens up blue that goes around the area of the home when you hover over it, that's a shape file that shows the exact property boundary, usually per the property tax group of that area. But we need that exact boundary in order to be precise. If I don't have that, I have to make assumptions of how much of the land is controlled by X company. Do they own every parcel within it? Is these parts that are next to it, are they emitting more carbon or less carbon, et cetera? If I have that, it makes me a lot more confident in that and bringing that confidence ratio up. But not everyone has a shapefile for their detail, especially in emerging economies where there's a lot of wealth getting created and a lot of opportunity. There's just not as much precision on property boundaries. So that's moving forward. But I think the firms that are looking to invest there, that would be a helpful thing if we had a little more advocacy of tell me exactly where this stops so that we can measure it precisely from the beginning instead of going through a restatement later when they realize, oops, we have this 7 hectares as well.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So I think, Nate, we have covered this arc of why the standards matter, academic credentialing, your stakeholders to keep you honest, and from the data, taking in the data to processing it to providing it to your client. And it seems comprehensive. I couldn't think of a major way that I would improve that unless you got more efficient or you're able to drive down the cost, of doing that activity. But it's still much more cost competitive, than putting a lot of boots on the ground. It probably saves a lot of CO2 and getting those reports as well. So we get to this point, and I'm reminded of the standard TPS files or the financial statements that a lot of banks push out. It's formatted really well, but I don't know what it means.
Exactly.
Right? And I
mystified.
Yeah, you have to be a domain expert just to understand what just happened. And maybe you don't want to be a domain expert. You just want to say, is this investable or not? So the last step seems you have to take is, how do you communicate this effectively to non-domain experts?
Great question. And again, that's my whole job with Dr. Gopal and with Josh Pitts, who are both, as I mentioned, public academics, is if I don't understand it, then it's probably harder for our customers to as well. So all of our collateral, hopefully all of our website, we would welcome feedback on it as well if you think any of it's confusing. But really getting the stakeholder to understand a defensible baseline. So where do you start? What was year one for you and doing the measurement or doing the reporting, et cetera? If you don't understand that first, you really should talk to whoever gave you that data, be it your assumption model, a provider like us, your auditor, et cetera. If they can't explain it well to you, then you need to shop around, because the science can be super confusing and can be really intimidating, but really shouldn't be. Like as I've described it today, hopefully that makes sense, but we're essentially saying, take a picture. It's really hard to argue with evidence that's a photograph, especially when you can actually see the actual molecules themselves. So if that's not as clear for you in your role as a stakeholder for it, then you need to ask some questions for the people that you're paying to give you that report in the first place. And I really have to take my hat off to KPMG. They're very good at explaining to their companies what they're actually getting, because our technology is very new and it can be very scary for people to change 20 years of precedent with something that obviously makes a lot of sense, hopefully to all of you, but for a firm that has billions of dollars in stock value or other commitments that have been made, that can be really, really intimidating. So getting different stakeholders to understand the science, getting bona fides like the ISO standards certification through Acerta and others really should help kind of assuage the concern. And then the last thing for us is this is really where Suchi has innovated for 20 years, where she's written and published to say, the stakes are high, let's use real data. Why are we just pretending with fake data when it actually can exist? Like, please use this. Let's just build some carrots so businesses do it, because they'll do it if you give them the rules.
You know, when I'm struck by, okay, so KPMG delivers the report, and again, the arc that we've just done, it's actually to help you understand the MRV value add, right? Yeah. And now we get to a point where the natural question that comes to mind is, let's just assume you're doing this right. Okay, you have all the credentialing, everything we've talked to, the arc. What is a tail for you that's of concern? What's a red flag for an MRV process, no names, but an MRV process that would be a red flag, and how would you respond to, or if a client had an MRV from delivering that, what questions would you ask if you saw those red flags?
Sure. So first red flag for us would be if there's a massive restatement from a corporate or an investment group or even a nation without much explanation, that's a massive red flag. It means that somebody just had pressure put on them to either flip to a new firm or flip to another procedure without really feeling like they needed to explain themselves.
So just a gap, or like a ghost, like a ghost report. Nothing to see here, kind of Jedi mind trick.
Exactly. So it's always been fine.
The absence of data is a red flag for you.
And well, and our whole business, as you can probably imagine, is transparency. Like you really need to own what is yours. Like one of the sessions yesterday, I was actually highlighting like companies really need to own what is theirs and have objectivity about it. Because I really do think, and as a consumer, like we all are, I am much more amenable to a company that says, here's where I messed up and I'm trying to do this better, instead of everything's awesome all the time and I'm great. Like I saw an interview with the CEO of Costco, which my family has supported a lot. I have 5 kids. And he had made a marketing decision that was absolutely terrible for them on a new product line. And he stood up in front of his shareholders at the meeting and said, I made this mistake. This is how I thought about it. And this is what I did. And I'm so sorry. And now we're going a different direction. If companies will go to that level in sustainability, obviously you need to be profitable. You need to make sure your shareholders are happy. EPS is going to stay EPS. But if you, in your learning time, which hopefully we're on the tail end of now, can have that transparency and that approach to buying goodwill from people, and by saying, I didn't get a PhD in this, but here's the best I did with the info I had, and this is why we're going forward with these new providers or this new procedure or measurement instead of attribution, I think you're going to get a lot more loyalty and you're going to get a lot more respect. Because being in COP, people are really looking for something they can actually do. They're kind of done with the speeches and the, oh no, we're all going to die. They're like, no, let's fix this and make it better and give people enough rules and opportunities to where entrepreneurs like us can actually accomplish the goals of the decision makers for them.
I think that was very well put, actually. And it reminds me of going back to some of my time doing compliance for State Department and Marine Corps. Any time that I saw too perfect of a detachment, or the 702 point inspection that we did, which is over finance and physical and intangible assets, that was a big red flag. Absence of data, or just perfect data, seems to be the issue. And I had an opportunity to talk with a previous chief compliance officer of the NASDAQ. And he said, yeah, the key thing about compliance is you will find things that are wrong. You have to know that you're not going to have a perfect process, but it is about trying to make sure the checks aren't intervals. So if there's 100 transactions, if you can check 10 of those 100, that's good. If you can do 100 of 100, that's best. So your compliance program should ideally focus on checking the 100 knowing that you're going to have issues on throughout, and that you address those issues. That's the whole idea of a compliance program. Now, you've just mentioned lack of data. Consumer receives the report. Are there anything specifically technical, or the CVs of the team? How deep should a customer look at the data that you provide to make sure, or any MRV provides, to make sure it's quality?
Oh, sure. Yeah, first, I definitely look for the education of a founder or the chief science officer of an MRV firm. Because there are, I don't mean to bash anybody, but there are a ton of companies like mine that are getting created every day because this industry is growing and it's huge and there's a lot of money to be made. I don't begrudge anybody for that. But if you are just going into Google BigQuery and taking a satellite image, plopping it on a beautiful report that somebody made to you and saying, here's your scope 1, that's totally greenwashing and you have no idea what you're doing. And so we often talk with our customers and they'll say like, okay, if some of your data is open source from satellites like JAXA or NASA or JPL, what's to prevent me from just doing it? And I'm like, let's pull it up together and go walk them through like, this is what the satellites actually spit out. Here are the steps you need to actually get to a defensible number that actually does have a grounding in science. It's hundreds and hundreds of steps built on 20 years of work. And if you don't see that in somebody's pedigree from the founding team, it usually means they're a tech person who said, oh, I'm going to make a lot of money. Boom. So watch that first would be the pedigrees of the founders. Second is you want to look for those bona fides. So look for ISO, look for CSRD compliance, look for greenhouse gas protocol. And then third for me is I look for innovation. And obviously I'm an entrepreneur, so I'm going to praise that myself. But like this industry needs creativity because it's new. And everybody is building the essentially the empire together. If you don't have a creative mind in this, it's not like you can work at the IRS and then jump straight into Floodlight and do the same. There are not the same rules and protocols involved. If you can understand the concepts that the legislation like CSRD and others are changing the world with, and then creatively apply it, while making it understandable to anybody in this industry, I think that's what you want to watch for. So bona fides first, experience second, and then creativity third.
So as you're delivering this report, it's a PDF. You've just prepped your customer, your potential customer, to know how to evaluate you, or what's a quality way to do that, or any MRV firm. Can you talk just generally, what are some of the areas that you're not in now but might be interesting, now that you're making a commitment, sure, might be interested in going in, and where's the need? This question comes out of a lot of questions that we've had throughout this COP, stopping by the standards, looking at what great programs that are going on in the DRC, where it seems to be a whole of government effort to be a leader and begin those discussions in the trilateral accords between Brazil, DRC, Indonesia. There's been fascinating updates, but also I don't think the tech yet exists to monitor that diverse biodiversity that exists in three very different ecologies, from tropical to even coral reefs. When you think about biodiversity, what would you think your approach would be to monitoring that biodiversity?
Sure. Yeah, so one of the things that gets us really excited is specifically a water monitoring as well, because currently it's really hard with a satellite to go much deeper than about 10 meters underwater unless it's very, very clear water, which there isn't a lot of on the planet. And so knowing obviously how important all of the world's ecosystems are on water, including the organisms all walking around this pavilion, understanding what is coming from the ground that's purifying versus the rest, what is coming from cities that's well managed. And again, going back to Los Angeles, they have a massive tube that takes all the waste of the city out about 5 miles and then kind of dumps it into the jet stream. It's all environmentally friendly. It's done kind of with the EPA's blessing on it. But when I first heard that, I was like, oh, gross, I swim in that ocean. But that was my own academic misunderstanding of just everything needs to be pristine. This is how the Earth cycle has always worked as long as humans have been on it. So I'm really excited about water because I think that's usually the bellwether for what's happening. And with the excess of water kind of going up. So I lived in the Netherlands for 2 years, and half of that country has been reclaimed from the sea. So they're obviously very, very worried about more polar ice cap melting, because that's half of their nation and probably the other half if it's too far. But just seeing what the effects would be from that, and then what you're able to do to mitigate that as a nation like they have, again, kind of comes to that creativity piece that I think you can only do if you're not a doom and gloom person. Like, there's certainly a lot of people that are calling out with very intelligent concerns. If we don't change this, XYZ scenario will happen and destroy us all. Fine, you can live there if you want to. I'd much rather be in the place where I see a lot of minds firing on I want the world to be better for myself, for my family, for my country, for my area. And for me, I left banking because I really felt like I wasn't doing anything with my potential. I really felt like I wanted to do more to actually help the people around me. And it's great to give people a credit card, but if that was my whole statement in life and then I retire, that's not much. So being inspired about a bit by COP and seeing what other people have done with their skills and abilities here, you really need that creativity, and I think sustainability is pulling in some of the most creative minds across the world now. So it's a great space to work in.
Absolutely. This has been a really interesting conversation. So again, just to recap, we started off getting a little bit of your background, a little background on Sagent, which again is a digital asset exchange. There's a matching engine, there's a settlements platform, we have various APIs for MRV firms. And what we're focusing on is why we're working very closely with global legislators, is taking this policy, abstracting it into a compliance state machine, so there's a transparent, auditable, immutable record of policy and how it's being implemented. And then as those eco assets, which are exchange of commodities, it could be an exchange of an actual environmental benefit, are occurring, that we monitor that, have market insights on an exchange. And that's really where we specialize. You have, I think, a comprehensive and quite impressive platform as we've gone through the entire arc. And I think both of us are proud to announce that right before the session began,
5 minutes before?
Yeah, 5 minutes before. We have fully executed our MOU to develop an integration so that Sagent, as we're minting these digital assets, will use Floodlight's MRV pedigree to make sure that the commodities that we're monitoring are high quality and they meet international standards, and probably going to be doing some new tech development collaboratively too. And the new area will be OECD compliance. So much more to follow on that, but to ensure that there's a remote, reliable way to ensure that the mines are run with OECD compliance standards.
Yep. We're very excited about it, and I think you guys are really leading the way well in saying everything that's sold, everything that's pulled out of an area really can have a unique marker on it that's traceable to any stakeholder that needs it. And why not attach the environmental data right there? Because then you actually knock out 90% of the regulation that firms and countries are putting on it now, is they just don't want to get cheated, and they want to make sure that everything that they've promised as a politician or a leader is getting accomplished. So again, putting that carrot in front of the business community to do it works. We're going to prove it.
Nice. And Nate, it's going to be great working with you. I think we'll have a much more to announce next week, but we have 6 months that we've planned out for this MOU. We have a huge announcement about a commodities exchange that will launch. We already have our first strategic partner on it. And as we're developing it, the mission really is to just make sure that everybody understands it's as high quality as possible from our monitoring, as the exchange will be a self-regulating organization, very much like any other commodities exchange, in that it's as efficient as possible to show you that we're meeting the general mandate of COP, and that is to make the world a greener place, to make sure that we're focusing on the autonomous peoples and ensuring that they're part of this growth trajectory. So honored to spend the last hour with you. I'll give you the closing remarks.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I really do think we're at a climax really of sustainability now, where there's enough money to be made in the industry where you're bringing in the business community, whereas before I think the business community saw this as adversarial. And so kind of modeling the approach as our two firms are of doing this well, making all the stakeholders compliant, happy, and discoverable info is exactly how the business should run, and it'll be better across the board. So very excited and proud to be working with you.
Awesome. Thank you, and really appreciate everyone dialing in today.